Thank you, Anne Marie. It is a real pleasure to be here, and it is one that I have thought a great deal about since being contacted. First of all, I have to thank the Center for Canadian Studies. I told Anne Marie the other day I have a daughter who lives in Vancouver. My father was Canadian, who is also an illegal immigrant, which I find interesting. I never thought about it until the job that I have now, and that corresponds with some kinds of things. So that connection is very firm, and when I know that some kinds of things are happening in Canada, it is very close to our hearts for those of us in Michigan. When I talk about human trafficking, the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force was founded approximately 10 years ago. And it was founded 10 years ago because there was an article in the New York Times on a Sunday which indicated that 100 workers from Mexico were brought into New York City who were deaf mutes because of a promise that they were going to have a better life through education and training and returning to Mexico. The second case that was cited was an issue of prostitution with adolescents in California and young girls who were being trafficked and sold, and the words trafficked were started to be used. First of all, I want you to know that on the panel today, you are going to hear some very experts in terms of their interpretation. But I'm going to give you what I view as something that if I were to say, I want you to memorize this statement, because it is a statement that is from the heart. And human trafficking is something that one not only has to look at in very realistic and logical kinds of terms, but you also have to understand that it is a human rights issue. So my definition of modern day slavery is the perfect storm of how poverty, chaos, destructive relationships, and the potential of opportunity will exist for those who desperately have listened and have been promised a better life through a job or through a relationship based on care, and it is within their reach. But then discover the robbing of their humanity, their soul, and their control with no way out. You know, if one defines the word soul, that is the very integral part of our being a human being. So when one talks about one's soul being robbed, that is something that we need to examine. And so the issues that are before the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force were, how is it that we can have an impact on slavery and persuade people in Michigan and in our communities that human trafficking is a reality? I noticed with interest that perhaps 5, maybe 6 hands went up in terms of recognition of human trafficking. I have not spoke with a group, and I've spoken with thousands of people across the state in all kinds of opportunities that I never ever knew that existed. That generally speaking, when we ask the question, how many of you believe that you have been involved in any kind of recognition of human trafficking? There are about 5 or 6. And that at the end of the presentation, we ask the question again. How many of you believe that you have interacted with the issues of human trafficking? And hands go up all over the room. Doesn't matter whether one is a physician, one is a police officer, one is a community member, or one is a member of some kind of financial institution. So when we talk about what human trafficking is, what we were talking about is how do you bring people to the table? When again, there is no data or information that it exists. And so there was one word that was very firm, and that was because of the work that I was doing in community policing, and that is success will only come about through collaboration. Now, collaboration is a term that we can bounce around like a basketball on a court. And if I ask each one of you what collaboration meant, you would have a wonderful explanation. And then if I were to ask you, do you have true collaboration in whatever you do, we would find that it is more difficult than what we thought. And it is more difficult because we are trying to establish a trust relationship, and nobody trusts anybody. For police departments or hospitals, we say to them, how many departments exist in your organization? And the answers always are 8, 12, 15, 17. So within our own organizations, we have the issue, and yet we are asking that if you really are going to look at the issues of human trafficking, collaboration must come about. It's not a nice thing. It is not a partnership. It is collaboration, and that is what brings people to the table. Currently, we have 135 agencies, started with 20. 135 agencies who drift in and out, but there's one thing about all of those agencies. There's no reason to belong to the task force. There's no acclamation of accolades. There's no kind of financial rewards. The only reward that one has is that we can collectively talk about information that has impacted. For instance, there are many myths that exist about human trafficking. And if I were to ask about the word definition, most of us would probably use sexual exploitation as one of the firm kinds of commitments in terms of trafficking. And yet we know from the limited studies that we have that labor exploitation is much more in numbers. That is something that we have grappled with and have yet not looked at extensively in Michigan, but we certainly know that those figures exist. So one of the issues in coming to the table is looking at kinds of conditions and exploring what human trafficking really means. First of all, it's probably not a very good name. It really is modern day slavery. It exists for the whole purpose of financial gain. There's no other reason for it. And one of the things that is really important in looking at it is my question always, which is, where's the money? So even though I have a heart and I want to talk about the issues of soul, I want to know where the money is. And that means at my table, financial institutions and banks need to be there. Right now in the city of New York, 12 major firms of credit cards sat down at the table to say, what is it that we can do as we stem what are illegal cash kinds of flow that is going through our credit card industry? We need that locally too. We need that to find out whether it's credit unions. I had a call from a credit union the other day that said, what is it that we can do? It's time for them to be at the table. I think that if I were to look at what I believe that human trafficking is, I would say it is rather static at this point in time. And that's because we are so limited in the issues of information that is done in research. The research that has been done is extremely limited. It's extremely limited. You know, there's never one answer as to why something occurs or does not occur. And the limitation on it is that there is not funding that is necessary for those who work at universities. For those of you who are at universities, you know there has to be some kind of funding stream. We don't have funding streams. And yet, if we were to announce that the issue that cancer might be the number 2 cause of death, or not cancer, but it's, something would be the number 2 cause of death in the state of Michigan, we would put all kinds of financial resources, which leads me to another myth. How many of you heard the myth that Michigan is number 2, number 5, number 7 of human trafficking in Michigan? Now, if there's one thing that I want you to do when you leave here today in the next 5 days, I want you to contact 5 people and say, while it might be suggestive that we are more aware of human trafficking, the fact remains we don't have any idea whether Michigan would be number 2, number 5, or 15 because of a very simple explanation. We don't count cases. We don't count cases because we have no data collection. And that's true in Nevada and California. In New York, it doesn't matter. And the absence of reliable information makes it very, very difficult to approach the real necessity of exploring the various issues that are so pronounced in the issue. For instance, one of the issues that we need to look at in this state is the issue of the supply chain. The supply chain, I can tell all of us that, like it or not, every one of us is very involved in the use of materials, in the use of objects, in the use of what we eat, what we wear, what we use, by child slavery or adult slavery somewhere in the world. It would be very easy to say, we don't need to worry about a global connection. We do need to worry about a global connection, because that global connection is indeed where much of slavery comes from, those kinds of things that we use on a regular basis. So to deny that we are involved in human trafficking is to deny the very existence of what we unconsciously and unwittingly have happened in terms of that kind of thing. Human trafficking is toxic in the sense that one experiences a strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity in one's environment. What does that mean? That means that for every subject, do you remember Pigpen? Raise your hand if you know who Pigpen is. You know, we're sort of fascinated with Pigpen because there's this realm of dust and dirt that follows him. Whether he's on the baseball field, whether he's in his bed, whether he's walking down the street, and we somehow connect with that dirt. Trafficking is exactly the same thing. That's the way I live. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Normality is not even in a definition. It is chaos beyond belief. And so when we talk about Pigpen, we really are talking about the issue of a total breakdown of what normality is and whatever is done. So, you are going to hear some very specific information about what's happening in Michigan. And my urging is a couple of things. Number one, we need some accountability. Just because one puts a sign out and says, I support the issue of human trafficking and please give money, we need to say, what are the accountable kinds of things? The second is we need a strong strategic leadership in the state. We need to make sure that public policy is really defined on an issue that affects us all.